Neo felt the world shift around him in a way that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. One moment he was standing on the familiar streets of the Matrix, the neon glow reflecting off glass and steel, the hum of distant traffic forming the city's pulse. The next, the digital world dissolved like mist under a scorching sun, replaced by a darkness so profound it seemed to have weight. He blinked, trying to understand what had just happened, but the sky, or what passed for a sky, was no longer the calm, artificial expanse he had known. Instead, a churning, storm-laden void stretched overhead, jagged clouds glowing faintly red as if the air itself were ablaze with fury. The ground beneath his feet wasn't asphalt or concrete, but cracked, scarred stone, blackened and fractured, as though it had endured centuries of war. Neo's instincts screamed that he had crossed into a realm where death was constant and hope a fleeting luxury. All around him the air vibrated with the sounds of conflict. Far in the distance, a low rumble like rolling thunder was punctuated by explosions, each one sending plumes of dust and smoke spiraling into the sky. Closer, the screams of combat reached his ears, distorted and warped in a way that made them almost otherworldly. He could hear the cries of men and machines, the clashing of metal on metal, and something darker beneath it all, a low, almost musical growl that sent shivers down his spine. Neo's eyes darted around, taking in the sheer scale of the devastation. Towering structures, shattered and jagged, rose like broken teeth from the earth. They seemed both ancient and alien, Gothic in design yet massive beyond comprehension, adorned with spikes, skulls, and banners that fluttered in the heatless wind. He felt dwarfed, as if a mere human being could never truly comprehend the grandeur and horror coexisting in this place. The first figures that approached him were humanoid, but they were unlike any humans Neo had ever seen. Their armor gleamed with an unnatural luster, a combination of technology and artistry etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with power. They moved with precision, each step purposeful, their eyes scanning him as if evaluating whether he belonged or was merely another casualty waiting to happen. Neo instinctively lowered into a defensive stance, though his mind raced faster than his body could react. The instincts he had honed in the Matrix told him to dodge, to assess, but here he sensed a different set of rules. He had fought sentinels and agents, beings of pure code, but these were real, tangible, and carried the weight of centuries of battle and discipline. Their gaze felt like it could strip him bare, see not only his body, but the intentions within his soul. He tried to speak, to ask where he was, but the words felt weak, meaningless, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere around him. A distant roar split the air, sharper and closer than the previous sounds, and Neo's heart jumped. Out of the smoke and shadows emerged monstrous shapes, hulking silhouettes that moved with frightening agility despite their size. Weapons larger than anything Neo had seen in the Matrix glinted in the dim light, barrels capable of destroying entire squads with a single discharge. And yet, even in the face of such monstrosity, Neo felt a spark of curiosity, that familiar thrill of testing the impossible. The fight instincts he had carried with him from the Matrix surged forward, tempered now by the harsh reality of mortality. Here, a misstep could mean more than just a reload. It could mean a brutal, permanent end. Neo's vision widened as he tried to comprehend the sheer scale of the battlefield stretching before him. Entire ridges of land had been carved into defensive positions, trenches etched like scars across the terrain. Fires burned in every direction, consuming wreckage of machines and corpses alike, while distant silhouettes moved with purpose and violence. The architecture seemed alive, Gothic spires and fortifications rising toward the blood-red clouds as if they were reaching for some distant, vengeful deity. And within that chaos, he glimpsed the signs of war machines beyond comprehension. towering constructs that walked like gods, their mechanical limbs crushing everything in their path. Neo's mind, trained to manipulate a digital world with ease, struggled to process the weight of such reality, where physics was unforgiving and death omnipresent. He took a cautious step forward, and immediately the ground beneath him seemed to protest. Cracks spider-webbed through the stone, and debris tumbled into unseen depths, revealing the sheer instability of this universe. The air itself seemed dense, heavy with the scent of burning metal and flesh, of ozone and unidentifiable chemicals. Neo realized that survival here would require more than skill. It demanded adaptation, a recalibration of his understanding of reality. In the Matrix, he could bend rules at will, freeze bullets, leap impossibly, and dodge attacks with near omniscience. Here, those powers might give him an advantage, but they did not make him invincible. Every movement had to be calculated, measured against forces he had never faced before. As he advanced cautiously, Neo began to see smaller figures scurrying through the wreckage. Humans, barely recognizable as such, clad in ragged armor and carrying crude weapons. Their faces were etched with fear and exhaustion, eyes darting toward him in a mixture of hope and suspicion. Some whispered prayers to gods he did not understand. Others merely ran, trying to survive another day in this merciless universe. Neo felt a strange pang of empathy, a reminder that despite the fantastical horrors surrounding him, the heart of this world was still beating with human struggle. And that struggle, Neo realized, might become the very thing that would define his purpose here, in a galaxy that had no patience for the weak and no mercy for the unprepared.
Neo moved cautiously through the scarred landscape, each step echoing unnaturally in the heavy air. His senses, honed in the Matrix to detect the subtlest shifts in the digital code, now strained to comprehend a reality that was tactile, brutal, and unyielding. The ground beneath him was uneven, littered with jagged debris and fragments of machines that had been twisted and burned beyond recognition. Smoke hung thickly in the air, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder, blood, and something more primal, something ancient and terrible. Neo's instincts told him to remain hidden, yet his curiosity, the same force that had driven him through countless impossible scenarios in the Matrix, compelled him to move forward, to see what lay beyond the haze of war. As he rounded a broken spire, Neo caught sight of movement, figures emerging from the smoke like statues of living metal. They were clad in armor that shimmered with a sheen both polished and battle-worn, adorned with symbols he could not decipher, but somehow recognized as warnings, talismans, and banners of allegiance. Each step they took resonated with purpose and authority, the sound amplified by the crunch of debris under their boots. Neo felt the weight of their presence before he even saw them clearly. He knew instinctively that these were not ordinary soldiers. These were beings trained for a level of war he had never experienced, their very existence forged in the fires of relentless combat. One of the figures stepped forward, taller than a man should be, yet moving with a precision that was almost graceful. The visor of the helmet reflected the red-tinged smoke, and Neo could sense an intelligence behind it, a mind that assessed, calculated, and judged him in an instant. His hand twitched instinctively toward his own gear, searching for weapons, for anything familiar, but the traditional tools of the Matrix were useless here. In this universe, the rules were cruelly concrete, and the consequences of misjudgment immediate and often fatal. "Identify yourself," a voice boomed from the armored figure, metallic and resonant, echoing across the shattered terrain. Neo froze, weighing his options. He could feel the others behind the leader, their armor glinting in the smoky light, weapons raised, ready to strike at the smallest sign of threat. He realized then that in this place, hesitation could be as dangerous as aggression. I'm Neo," he said cautiously, his voice sounding small and uncertain in comparison to the authority around him. I don't know where I am. I mean no harm." The armored leader tilted his head, as if analyzing Neo's very being. "A strange one?" he muttered, his voice softer now, almost contemplative. "Yet he moves with purpose and confidence beyond ordinary men. Stay vigilant, squad. Observe him closely." Neo noticed other figures shifting, their attention alternating between him and the distant battlefield, their movements practiced and disciplined. He could feel their evaluation pressing down on him, a mental weight almost as tangible as the rubble beneath his feet. Neo tried to explain, to bridge the gap between his world and theirs, but the words stumbled over themselves. I come from somewhere else," he began, but even he knew that the abstract concept of alternate realities or simulated worlds would be meaningless here. These warriors had lived through wars that bent the laws of physics themselves, their minds honed to survive impossible odds. He realized quickly that actions would speak louder than explanations. Without warning, a distant explosion shook the ground, sending a spray of dust and debris into the air. The armored squad immediately shifted, weapons raised, scanning the horizon with practiced precision. Neo instinctively ducked behind a fractured pillar, feeling the vibrations of distant gunfire in his chest. He realized that he could survive longer if he understood the rules of engagement in this universe, if he adapted quickly to the rhythms of combat and the instincts of these soldiers. Every movement they made was deliberate, and even their gaze seemed to map out every possible threat, including him. One of the squad members stepped closer, examining Neo's posture, his slight movements, the way he breathed. He understood that this was a silent assessment, a weighing of potential danger and value. Here, survival depended more than skill. It depended on perception, trust, and the ability to project strength without arrogance. Neo's own abilities, honed in a world where code bent to his will, felt different now, both a blessing and a complication. His reactions were instinctive, almost too fast for them to track, but the subtle cues of this universe, the weight of real consequences, forced him to reconsider every decision he made. The squad leader finally spoke again, a hint of curiosity breaking through the rigid authority. "He moves differently. He reacts differently. Not like a typical human, yet he bleeds and breathes as we do. Perhaps he is worth observing, even training." Neo sensed a tentative truce forming, fragile and uncertain, yet real. He realized that, for the first time since arriving in this universe, he had allies, or at least he had an opportunity to prove that his presence was not a threat. Neo allowed himself a slow breath, feeling the tension in his body ease slightly. He took another step forward, signaling with his hands that he meant no hostility. The squad mirrored his movements cautiously, yet without lowering their guard. For the first time since arriving, Neo began to sense that survival here might not only depend on fighting, but on understanding, on navigating a world where the rules were brutally different, and trust was a weapon as sharp as any blade or gun. As he walked beside the armored figures, Neo realized the immensity of what lay before him. The Imperium's warriors were formidable, their discipline unmatched, and their suspicion justified. Neo could already feel the subtle shift in his own understanding. He would have to learn their ways, adapt to their strategies, and perhaps find a new form of his own power in a universe where reality itself was merciless.
Neo had barely begun to walk alongside the armored warriors of the Imperium when the atmosphere shifted again, a subtle vibration that made his senses tighten. The air grew heavier, almost pulsating, carrying a stench unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was the smell of corruption, decay, and something ancient that gnawed at the soul itself. The sky above twisted with unnatural colors, reds and purples bleeding into sickly greens, casting jagged shadows across the broken terrain. Neo felt his instincts scream a warning. This was no ordinary battlefield, and the forces ahead were not mere soldiers or machines. These were beings born of pure malevolence, entities that thrived on chaos and death. Ahead, the landscape opened into a valley scarred by relentless conflict. Bodies, both human and alien, lay strewn across the ground, their forms twisted and grotesque, testament to battles fought with no mercy. Neo's eyes caught the movement first. Figures larger than men, clad in armor black as night, adorned with spikes and unholy sigils. Their weapons were not conventional. They exuded a malevolent energy, pulsating as if alive, eager to spill blood. Their very presence seemed to warp the air around them, reality bending in subtle ways. Neo's matrix-honed reflexes flared instinctively, allowing him to perceive movements just before they happened, but even he felt a flicker of doubt. Here, instinct was necessary, but not sufficient. The first Chaos Space Marine stepped forward, its armor decorated with grotesque carvings and the bones of the fallen. Its glowing eyes, visible through the narrow visor, locked onto Neo with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Neo's mind raced, comparing this to anything he had ever faced. Agents of the Matrix had been dangerous, but they obeyed a predictable set of rules, a code he could manipulate. These warriors were unpredictable, driven not by logic, but by an insatiable, otherworldly malice. Neo understood immediately that his usual tricks, dodging bullets, bending time, would only buy him moments, not safety. A guttural roar shattered the air as more figures emerged from the shadows, daemons and abominations that defied natural anatomy. Limbs twisted in impossible angles, eyes glowing with a sickly inner light, mouths stretching in eternal screams. Neo felt a cold realization. These creatures fed on fear, on the very act of surviving itself. His breathing became measured, deliberate, as he focused on the rhythm of the battlefield. Each step, each movement had to be precise. He dodged instinctively as a spiked chain swung past him, tearing into the rebel with a deafening shriek. The chaos was overwhelming, but he could not falter. Neo's mind flickered with the thought of the Matrix, the world where he had bent reality to his will. Here he could still move in ways impossible for ordinary men, faster, more fluid, anticipating attacks. But the laws of this universe were cruelly physical. Bullets and blades were real. Flesh could be pierced, bones shattered. Even his remarkable agility carried the risk of permanent injury. Yet, paradoxically, this danger heightened his awareness, sharpening every sense. He could read the flow of combat as though it were a code, interpreting the motions of his enemies in real time. The first Chaos Marine lunged, a massive power axe arcing through the air with lethal precision. Neo sidestepped, feeling the wind of the strike brush past his cheek, the sheer force sending vibrations through his body. He countered with a kick, leveraging his momentum to send the Marine stumbling back, but even then he felt the immense strength behind the armor. These were not mere men. They were living engines of war, forged for destruction, and he had to respect their power while exploiting their overconfidence. Around him, the battlefield erupted. Explosions shook the ground, sending clouds of dust and debris into the air. Daemons surged in waves, their forms flickering between solidity and some otherworldly energy, forcing Neo to constantly adjust his perception. He realized quickly that unlike the Matrix, where patterns could be decoded and manipulated, this universe demanded adaptability. Every attack, every movement was a test, a challenge to his mind and body in equal measure. He began to experiment, bending the limits of his reflexes and perception, slowing time in bursts, predicting trajectories, and using his environment with ruthless precision. Neo felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the battlefield itself could be an ally. Crumbling walls became shields, jagged debris turned into obstacles for his foes. He leapt over a fallen daemon, using its momentum to propel himself toward a cluster of Chaos Marines, striking in a controlled, almost balletic manner. For a moment, he felt like he was dancing through death itself.
each movement both defensive and offensive, a calculated rhythm amidst the madness. Yet the chaos was unrelenting. More forces poured into the valley, their numbers seemingly infinite. Neo could feel the warp energy saturating the area, twisting reality and making the impossible even more dangerous. His mind, trained to bend the rules of a simulated world, now struggled against a reality that would not yield. Every strike he made, every movement had consequences. He could no longer rely on the Matrix's safety nets. Each decision mattered, each action had weight, and he felt the first true taste of fear, a fear that was primal, unavoidable, and yet strangely motivating. Despite the terror, a clarity emerged. Neo understood that survival here required more than reflexes. It demanded understanding. He began to analyze the chaos forces, their patterns, the way they moved, the moments when their aggression could be turned against them. The Matrix had taught him to see beyond illusion, to perceive the underlying code. Here he sought the code in flesh, in steel, in the raw, brutal logic of a universe that demanded strength and ingenuity. He felt alive in a way he hadn't before, every sense attuned, every instinct engaged as he prepared to face the overwhelming, corrupting might of the chaos forces head-on.
Neo found a moment of stillness only after the last echo of gunfire faded into the toxic wind. The battlefield lay behind him like a nightmare cut open, spilling horrors across the blasted earth. Even for someone who had lived through the illusions of the Matrix, the brutality of this universe felt overwhelming. There were no lines of green code, no underlying algorithm to decipher, no hidden architecture he could dissect with his mind. Everything here was raw, physical, and viciously real. His wounds ached, not like digital glitches or temporary pain triggers, but like genuine reminders of mortality. He felt every bruise, every strained muscle, and the lingering tremor in his hands betrayed the shock he tried to suppress. The Space Marines who had escorted him paused at the edge of a ruined structure, exchanging silent gestures that indicated caution. Neo watched their movements closely. Even their smallest decision carried a gravity he'd never known in the sleek confines of the simulated world. These warriors lived every second expecting death, but they treated survival as routine. Their discipline fascinated him. Their resilience humbled him. He realized they were not only fighters, they were symbols of humanity carved into armor. If he was to understand this place, he had to understand them. He moved closer, observing how they scanned the area with unbroken focus. Their training seemed almost algorithmic, but not in the abstract digital way he was used to. It was etched into their bones, reinforced through centuries of doctrine, through a culture where war wasn't a possibility, it was the only certainty. Neo felt an odd sense of kinship. He too had spent years breaking free from an illusion to face the harsh truth beneath. But unlike the Matrix where truth freed the mind, this universe clung to harshness like a second skin. When he attempted to sense the world in the way he used to, reading patterns, predicting trajectories, feeling the rhythm in people's decisions, he found that only fragments responded. His instincts still worked, but the clarity was blurred. Reality here didn't bend, it pushed back. The more he tried to impose his old rules, the more dissonant his perceptions became. He wasn't fighting an illusion anymore, he was fighting the very laws of existence. That realization forced him into a strange vulnerability. He had to relearn everything. He knelt beside a shattered pillar, pressing his hand to the broken stone. It felt coarse, heavy with age, coated in grime and the residue of battle. He felt no hum of code, no digital vibration hiding beneath the surface. Just cold, unyielding reality. He closed his eyes, trying to sense the energy flow around him, hoping to tap into something familiar. But instead of structured lines of information, he felt a chaotic turbulence, a psychic storm pressing against his awareness. It rolled like thunder, distant yet unceasing, whispering with countless voices that clawed at the edge of his mind. Neo recoiled instinctively, and one of the Marines turned toward him, recognizing the reaction. "The warp," the Marine said in a tone that carried both dread and reverence. "Do not linger in its pull, it devours the unprepared." Neo listened, trying to understand. The warp, this psychic sea that underpinned reality, was unlike anything he had encountered. It wasn't structured like the Matrix, it wasn't governed by code. It was alive, shifting with emotion and thought, feeding on fear, rage, despair. It felt dangerously close to the digital shadows he once exploited, yet infinitely more volatile. He tried once more, cautiously, easing his awareness toward the warp's faint ripple. This time he steadied himself, grounding his mind in controlled breaths. He did not seek to manipulate it, he merely observed. And slowly, something clicked. It wasn't code, but it had patterns. Erratic, violent, fractured, but still patterns. They pulsed like chaotic heartbeats, responding to emotions not with logic, but with raw primal force. Neo began to map the rhythm just a little, understanding its ebb and flow enough to pull his mind back before it overwhelmed him. It exhausted him far faster than bending the Matrix ever had. His forehead dampened with sweat, and the muscles around his eyes tightened from the strain. But he learned something crucial. This universe could not be dominated by force of will alone. It demanded respect, adaptation, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. He would have to grow in ways he never imagined. The Space Marines approached a bunker entrance, signaling him to follow. Inside, dim lights flickered, illuminating equipment, relics, and maps marked with indecipherable runes. Neo stepped inside and immediately sensed the heavy, almost sacred atmosphere. War strategy wasn't a simulation here. It wasn't a controlled environment. Every line on the map represented lives, battles spanning galaxies, worlds lost to threats far beyond anything Neo had faced. One Marine placed a massive gauntlet on Neo's shoulder, surprisingly gentle despite the strength behind it. "You are not from any world we know, but this galaxy does not care for origin, only survival. Learn its truths or you will fall to them." Neo nodded, feeling the weight of the advice. Survive by learning, adapt by understanding. This was his new reality. There were no shortcuts, no digital loopholes, no hidden scripts to exploit. He had to let go of the instinct to treat this universe like a simulation and embrace it as a living, breathing, unforgiving plane of existence. He stood tall, inhaling the metallic air, accepting the fatigue in his limbs, the ache in his bones. He realized that learning this universe wasn't just about understanding its rules. It was about unlearning the comfort of the old ones. Everything here fought to kill. Everything demanded evolution. Everything tested the limits of humanity. And Neo knew he had no choice but to keep moving, keep learning, keep adapting, because the alternative in this ruthless universe was not failure, it was annihilation.
Neo sat in silence at the outskirts of the ruined bunker, his gaze fixed on the scorched horizon where night and fire merged into one endless crimson smear. His breathing was steady, but his mind churned with questions he had never imagined asking. The Matrix had once defined his limits, limits he had learned to break, rewrite, and transcend. Here, those boundaries served no purpose. They were ghosts of a world that no longer applied. This universe was built on a different foundation, one that felt thicker, heavier, older. It pushed back at him with every step he took, every breath he drew. And yet, somewhere beneath the suffocating weight of war and reality, he felt something stir, quiet at first, like a whisper behind a closed door. It wasn't the familiar hum of digital code. It wasn't the structured current of information that had once guided him. It was something organic, unpredictable, and powerful in a way he could not quite describe. He closed his eyes, letting the chaos of the battlefield fade into the background. He focused on the rhythm of his heartbeat, the warmth of his lungs filling with toxic air, the subtle tremor still left in his muscles from the fight with chaos. He pushed deeper, seeking the quiet place inside himself where instinct and thought intertwined. But what he found wasn't quiet. It wasn't still. It was a storm, a swirling force that crackled beneath his skin like electricity trying to escape. He exhaled sharply, startled by the intensity of it.
This wasn't the Matrix reacting to his will. This was something else reacting to him, as if the very universe were responding to his presence in ways he didn't yet understand. He extended his hand toward a chunk of shattered metal lying a few meters away. It was a simple gesture, something he had done countless times in the simulated world. He expected resistance, expected gravity to pin it in place, expected reality to ignore him the way it ignored all ordinary men. Instead, he felt the air around his hand thicken. A subtle vibration pulsed against his fingers. The metal fragment trembled, dust sliding off its surface. Neo's breath caught in his throat. He narrowed his focus, steadying his mind. The metal rose slowly, shakily, suspended in a faint, invisible tension that hummed in the space between them. It wasn't telekinesis in the way the Matrix had allowed him to manipulate objects through code. This was different. It felt connected to something external, something vast. The warp, perhaps, the psychic ocean that he still barely understood. Or maybe it was his own mind reacting to the raw energies of this universe. Either way, it moved. And that movement was real. Not simulated, not interpreted by a machine. Real. The weight of that truth sent a chill through him. The metal quivered as if fighting to break free. Then, in a sudden burst of instinct, Neo clenched his hand. The fragment compressed, groaning under pressure as the air around it rippled. Sparks flickered across its surface, dancing like tiny bolts of lightning before vanishing into the darkness. Neo let out a slow, reluctant breath, releasing the strain. The metal dropped, clattering onto the ground with a sound that was almost drowned out by the distant roar of artillery fire. He stared at his hand, his pulse quickening. The Marines nearby had turned, their helmets angled toward him. They didn't speak, but their stillness said enough. They had seen. They had noticed the abnormal ripple in reality, the kind that only psychers, psychically attuned individuals, could create. Neo wasn't one of them. He wasn't born of this galaxy, shaped by its energies or its torment, but something inside him had awakened, responding to the warp like a tuning fork responding to a distant vibration. One Marine approached him, the heavy footfalls echoing across the broken ground. That was not normal, the warrior said with stern curiosity. What are you? Neo shook his head slowly, his voice quiet but firm. I don't know anymore. The Marine studied him for a moment before turning slightly, his tone cautious. If the warp touches you, it will change you, for better or worse. Neo didn't respond. He didn't need to. The change was already happening. He could feel it in the way reality seemed more reactive now, the way his senses stretched farther than before. Sounds carried differently. Vibrations traveled through the earth into his bones, and his perception sharpened as though time itself flowed in a thicker, clearer stream. But it wasn't just heightened awareness. There was also danger, a lingering, shadowy presence that hovered at the edge of his consciousness, probing back as he probed it. The warp was not passive. It watched. It waited. He rose slowly, feeling the strange energy settle within him instead of fading. It clung to him, threading itself into the gaps left by the absence of the Matrix's digital code. It was wild and volatile, like handling fire with bare hands. But it was power, real power, not granted by machines or illusions, but drawn from something deeper, something primal. As he walked across the shattered plain, small ripples of force followed each step. Pebbles shifted, dust lifted. The air shimmered faintly around him, as if bending ever so slightly to accommodate whatever he was becoming. Neo didn't fully understand it, whether he was tapping into psychic forces, manipulating reality through instinct, or evolving into something new, but he felt the truth settle into his chest like a steady heartbeat. This universe was changing him, just as he was beginning to change it.
The battlefield stretched endlessly beneath the bruised sky of the 41st millennium, a place where hope was a rarity and survival a distant luxury. Neo stood at the center of this ruin, like a mismatched piece from a different puzzle, his long coat swaying in the toxic winds blowing across the ravaged wasteland. At first, the horrors surrounding him made little sense. Titanic war machines stomping through mountains of corpses, ancient tanks hurling shells that carved entire streets apart, and warriors clad in cathedral-like armor marching as if they had stepped out of a Gothic nightmare. Yet behind every thunderous explosion and every mechanical whine, Neo saw something else. A pattern, a rhythm, a code. Not digital code, like in the Matrix, but the same underlying logic that held together all systems, even this chaotic, war-devoured reality. It whispered to him, beckoning him to look deeper. He closed his eyes and extended his senses, feeling the world shift around him. The bullets, the explosions, the arcs of energy, each moved within a predictable waveform. Even the monstrous constructs of the Adeptus Mechanicus followed internal sequences, chains of logic that determined their movements and decisions. It wasn't the Matrix, but it felt close enough for him to grasp. When he opened his eyes again, everything around him slowed. Not because the world had changed, but because his perception of it had. Once again, Neo felt that familiar rush, the sensation of tapping into something bigger than flesh and bone. A squad of Chaos Marines thundered forward, their armor adorned with spikes, chains, and blasphemous symbols that radiated raw corruption. They towered over humans, their bolter cannons belching out rounds the size of small grenades. Neo watched the first bolt round slice toward him like a comet, leaving a burning trail through the air. People in this universe feared these weapons for good reason. One shot could tear a man apart. Neo simply tilted his head to the side, allowing the explosive round to drift past his cheek before it detonated behind him in a plume of fire. The Chaos Marine hesitated, perhaps confused that the mortal he had aimed at wasn't splattered across the ground. Neo stepped forward calmly, each movement a smooth flow, each breath syncing with the patterns of the world. More bolts flew. Neo began weaving between them as if dancing with the air itself. The Marines adjusted their aim, firing faster, but he moved through their barrage like a shadow slipping through cracks in reality. When one Marine charged directly at him, raising a massive chainsword roaring with demonic energy, Neo placed his hand gently on the creature's gauntlet and pushed. It wasn't strength that sent the armored giant flying. It was precision. Neo had seen the exact moment where the Marine's balance faltered, the millisecond where all the weight shifted to one foot, and he redirected it. The Marine crashed into a metal pillar, denting it inward. For a second, everything seemed under Neo's control, until the world around him shifted violently with a psychic scream. A sorcerer emerged from behind a pile of runes, his armor etched with runes that pulsed with warp energy. The sorcerer didn't move with logic or follow predictable patterns. His power came from the warp, a place where pure madness became reality. The psychic blast he hurled at Neo warped the air itself, bending space and shredding matter. Neo tried to read it, to follow its flow the way he followed bullets, but the surge of chaotic energy defied all order. The blast slammed into him and sent him crashing across the rubble. For the first time since arriving, he felt genuine disruption, like static tearing through his senses. Neo pushed himself to his feet, shaking off the dust, but the sorcerer was already charging another psychic attack. He steadied his breathing and focused. The warp was madness, yes, but even madness had patterns, even if those patterns spiraled in unpredictable directions. If code could be bent, perhaps the warp could be shaped. He raised his hand, not to block the attack physically, but to feel its structure. The psychic energy roared toward him like a wave of screaming souls. Neo stepped into it, letting his senses ride along its path. He didn't overpower the attack, he understood it. The moment its structure revealed a weakness, he turned the tide back toward the sorcerer. The feedback struck the Chaos Psyker unexpectedly, blasting him off his feet and dimming the glow of his runes. Neo's heart thundered in his chest, but he didn't stop moving. He surged forward, closing the distance in a blur. The sorcerer tried to raise a barrier, but Neo slipped through it like water, striking precisely where the field flickered. The barrier shattered, and the sorcerer collapsed beneath the impact. The remaining Chaos Marines hesitated, unsure whether the being they were facing was mortal or something far stranger. Neo stood still, breathing slowly, feeling the code-like pulse of this universe rushing through him. He couldn't rewrite reality here, not the way he could in the Matrix, but he could bend it, read it, influence its flow. And that made him something the galaxy had never seen before, something it wasn't prepared to understand. The battlefield around him rumbled with distant artillery, storm clouds churned with warp lightning, and the scent of ash and metal filled the air as Neo prepared to move again, adapting to a universe built on violence and chaos, yet still bound by patterns waiting for him to uncover.
The inquisitorial dropship cut through the storm clouds like a shard of metal hurled by an angry god, its engines growling with the promise of judgment. Neo stood inside its dimly lit hold, surrounded by a semicircle of inquisitorial stormtroopers whose expressions revealed a mix of suspicion, fear, and something close to hostility. Their armor bore the sigils of the Ordo Malleus, and their weapons were trained near, but not directly at, Neo, as if they wanted him to know he was moments away from being executed should he make a single wrong move. He didn't blame them. He was an anomaly in a universe where anomalies usually meant demonic corruption or heresy. To them, he was another problem to eliminate before he grew into a larger threat. At the far end stood Inquisitor Thale Cordron, a man built like the very machinery he worshipped. His armor was lacquered black, inscribed with purity seals that fluttered in the cold air of the dropship. A bionic eye whirred softly as it focused on Neo, studying him like a surgeon examining a particularly dangerous pathogen. The Inquisitor's voice finally cut through the rumble of the ship, sharp and accusing. He demanded to know what Neo was, how he had deflected warp-borne energy, how he had moved fast enough to evade bolt rounds, and why his presence radiated a sense of instability that made even hardened warriors uneasy. Neo didn't lie, but he didn't explain everything either. He wasn't even sure the words he had from his reality would make sense here. The Matrix didn't exist in this world, yet something like it lingered beneath the surface, a foundational layer of logic he could sense but not fully touch. When he said he wasn't a psyker, the stormtroopers exchanged looks of disbelief, and Thale's mechanical eye flickered with irritation. Psykers were feared, regulated, and burned by the thousands if they showed too much potential. But someone who wasn't a psyker doing the impossible? That was worse. That was an unknown variable, and unknown variables were purged in this universe. Still, Thale didn't order Neo's execution. Not yet. There was something in Neo's presence that he couldn't categorize, and Inquisitors lived for the opportunity to dissect the unexplained. The dropship lurched as it descended lower, turbulence rocking the hold. Outside, flashes of red lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the silhouette of a ruined city below. Neo stepped toward the viewing slit and saw a landscape torn apart by war, collapsed spires, shattered statues, burning trenches, and massive craters that glowed with radioactive light. At the center of this devastation pulsed a tear in reality, a swirling rift of colors that defied logic. A warp breach. Even Neo, unfamiliar with the full nature of the warp, could feel its presence pressing against his senses like a static-filled signal broadcasting madness. Thale approached him slowly, as if speaking to a weapon that might detonate at any moment. He explained that the breach was growing, feeding on fear and death, and if left unchecked, an entire subsector could be consumed. Imperial forces had already thrown tens of thousands into the fire just to slow the demonic tide pouring from the rift. This was their world, a place where extinction was always one miscalculation away. Thale's tone shifted slightly as he spoke, revealing the real reason Neo was still alive. The Inquisition wasn't known for mercy,
but it was known for using every tool, every anomaly, every advantage in its quest to protect humanity. Thale needed Neo, not as an ally, Neo could hear that clearly, but as a weapon, a scalpel to cut into the breach and disrupt whatever was fueling it. Neo wasn't sure if he trusted the Inquisitor, but he understood desperation when he saw it. These people were fighting a war that never ended, a war not just against armies, but against the universe itself. The breach called to him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. There was structure there, buried under the madness, a pattern flickering like a corrupted signal waiting to be decoded. He didn't know if he could touch it safely, but he felt pulled toward it, the same way he had once been pulled toward the Matrix when he realized what he could do. The drop ship landed with a heavy jolt. The doors hissed open, revealing a storm-blasted battlefield illuminated by fire and warp glow. Imperial guardsmen scrambled behind barricades, exchanging fire with twisted daemons that slithered from the breach like nightmares made flesh. Bolter fire cracked, artillery thundered, and the air vibrated with psychic echoes that made Neo's skin crawl. As he stepped out, the world around him slowed again, not out of fear, but instinct. He saw trajectories of bullets, arcs of incendiary blasts, the erratic movements of daemons whose bodies twisted impossibly with each step. Thale's voice cut through the chaos, ordering him to advance toward the breach. Neo moved forward, each step carrying him deeper into the heart of distortion. The closer he got, the more the world warped. Colors stretched and smeared, sounds stuttered, and the ground beneath him rippled like a disturbed reflection. The breach pulsed, vomiting tendrils of energy that tried to claw at his mind. He stood his ground, focusing on the underlying rhythm beneath the chaos. There was something like code in the warp's pulse, not digital, but conceptual, a structure of fear, memory, belief, and madness intertwining like a living equation. Neo reached out with his perception, not trying to overpower the distortion, but to understand it. The warp lashed at him, testing him, trying to unravel him. But he had faced illusions before, worlds built on lies and broken logic, and he wasn't so easily undone. The breach flickered, reacting to his presence. The daemons around him shrieked, their forms glitching violently, as if something interfering with their very existence was beginning to rewrite the rules around them. Thale watched from behind cover, stunned at what he was witnessing, unsure whether he was seeing a miracle or the birth of something even more dangerous than the warp itself.
The deeper Neo moved into the heart of the warp breach, the more the world seemed to fall apart around him. Shapes lost their meaning. Times stretched and folded. Sounds arrived out of order, echoing before they were made, overlapping with voices that didn't belong to living throats. The ground below him pulsed like something breathing, cracks opening and closing as if the planet itself were alive and afraid. Yet through all the madness, Neo kept walking, his steps steady, his focus locked on the strange rhythm beneath the chaos. It wasn't like the Matrix, but it reminded him of it, a tangled network of impulses, signals, and emotional weight. Not code, but something that behaved like code, something he could read if he remained calm enough. Behind him, the Imperial battle line trembled under the pressure of demonic assault. Guardsmen fired frantically, commissars shouted threats and prayers, and towering Grey Knights waded through tides of abominations with halberds glowing in psychic fire. Their psychic wards pushed back the warp like islands resisting a storm, allowing the Imperials to regain a foothold. Yet through the breach only grew angrier, vomiting more twisted forms that howled at Neo as if recognizing him as a threat to their existence. They surged toward him, claws dragging across the ruined earth, bodies warping into impossible shapes mid-charge. Neo moved before they reached him. The world slowed around him, not because of any supernatural power, but because of the instinct he'd honed in countless battles. Every movement, every twitch, every ripple of energy became part of a pattern. The first demon lunged, jaws splitting open too wide to be natural. Neo lowered his body, stepped beneath the creature's leap and drove his palm into its chest. Instead of breaking bones, there weren't any bones. His strike disrupted the shimmering threads that held the creature together. It exploded into smoke and flickering symbols that dissolved into the air. Two more came from either side. Neo spun between them, his coat flaring out like a torn banner in the wind, dodging slashing talons by inches. He grabbed one creature's arm, if it could be called an arm, and twisted. The demon unraveled like a glitching hologram, its scream dissolving into static. The second demon crashed into him with the force of a truck, hurling him backward. He rolled, rose without hesitation, and dashed forward again, adjusting his movement to match the distortions bending the battlefield. He wasn't fighting with brute strength, he was fighting through understanding, sensing where each creature's existence began to flicker and striking exactly at that threshold. The warp pulsed violently in response, as if infuriated. A wave of psychic pressure slammed into him, nearly knocking him off his feet. The surge carried whispers, hundreds, thousands, layered with fear, hatred, hunger, and ancient predatory instinct. The warp tried to dig into his mind, to understand him the way he was trying to understand it. Neo gritted his teeth and forced the intrusive sensations away. He had had worlds try to control his mind before. He had broken free then, and he wasn't about to surrender now. But the warp wasn't done. From within the swirling mass, a shape began to form, taller than a tank and wrapped in a shroud of shifting nightmares. A demon prince stepped forward, its wings spreading wide, its horns scraping against the distorted air. Each step it took cracked the ground, sending pulses through the breach. It looked at Neo with burning eyes that carried aeons of malice. Neo felt the pressure immediately. The creature wasn't just physical. It was psychic, conceptual, symbolic. It existed because the warp willed it, and the warp wanted Neo destroyed. The demon's voice thundered inside his skull without vibrating the air. It mocked him, calling him a broken fragment from a dead world, a mistake, a ghost clinging to a reality that didn't belong to his. Neo didn't answer. Words wouldn't change anything. The creature raised a clawed hand, and the ground beneath Neo liquefied into tendrils of living shadow that tried to wrap around his legs. Neo leapt upward, twisting through the air, landing on solid ground only a foot away from where he would have been dragged under. The demon prince lunged, swinging a wing toward him like a blade. Neo ducked, the air screaming above him as the attack sliced through it. He moved in close, faster than the demon expected, driving a punch into the creature's abdomen. For a brief moment, the demon's form glitched, its lower half disappearing before flickering back, but the blow barely slowed it. The prince backhanded him with enough force to shatter stone. Neo flew across the battlefield, skidding through broken debris before flipping onto his feet. His ribs screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He breathed deeply, syncing his senses with the distortion around him. The warp didn't follow logic, but it followed emotion. Patterns formed from fear, desire, rage, and belief. Neo let the noise of the warp flood his mind, not to overwhelm him, but to reveal its own disharmony. The demon prince leapt again, claws ready to tear him apart. Neo sprinted forward, weaving through the torrent of warp energy like he had once navigated digital streams. He didn't overpower the warp, he slipped between its cracks. The demon swung, Neo stepped aside. The monster roared, Neo was already behind it. The creature summoned chains of pure psychic energy that lashed toward him. Neo flowed around them, each movement precise, each dodge a reading of the underlying rhythm. He struck the demon at the moment its form weakened, when the threads of its existence stretched thin, and the impact sent shockwaves through the creature's entire being. The warp screamed in frustration. The breach flickered violently, its edge shuddering like a glitch in a corrupted program. Neo could feel it. He was close to something, to understanding how the breach held together, how it was anchored to emotion and belief. He wasn't sure if he could tear it apart, but he felt the possibility like a pulse under his fingertips. Behind him, the Imperial battle line trembled under the pressure of demonic assault. Guardsmen fired frantically, commissars shouted threats and prayers, and towering Grey Knights waded through tides of abominations with halberds glowing in psychic fire.
Their psychic wards pushed back the warp like islands resisting a storm, allowing the Imperials to regain a foothold. Yet the breach only grew angrier, vomiting more twisted forms that howled at Neo as if recognizing him as a threat to their existence. They surged toward him, claws dragging across the ruined earth, bodies warping into impossible shapes mid-charge. Neo moved before they reached him.
The ground trembled beneath Neo's feet as the Demon Prince let out a roar that rippled through the broken reality around them, shaking the very air like a struck metal plate. Every fragment of the warp breach seemed to pulse in response, as if the creature was its heart, beating fury and corruption into the world. The Imperial lines behind Neo were crumbling under the pressure. Guardsmen fled or were dragged screaming into the breach by clawed hands that appeared out of nowhere. Even the Grey Knights, warriors who treated demons as routine enemies, were being forced back step by step. Yet Neo remained in the center of this storm, staring at a being that defied everything he knew about existence. He wasn't afraid, but he couldn't deny the weight pressing against his mind, urging him to collapse, give up, let the warp swallow him whole. But Neo had never been someone who surrendered to inevitability. The Demon Prince lunged again, and Neo moved with a speed that left afterimages lingering in the warped air. Each attack the creature launched was powerful enough to tear tanks apart, but Neo slipped between them with the same calm precision he once used to dodge bullets in another lifetime. Yet every time he struck back, jumping, twisting, landing blows that should have shattered bones, the demon's form bent and twisted, but didn't break. It was like punching smoke held together by hatred. Neo couldn't win this fight with strength alone. He had to understand it. He closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the noise of the battlefield fade into the background. He wasn't meditating, he was listening. The warp didn't speak in words or thoughts. It spoke in raw sensation, in urges and impulses. Rage ebbed like an electric tide, fear pressed like cold fingers against his spine, and beneath it all he sensed something deeper. The anchor of the breach itself, the core emotion feeding it. It wasn't anger, it wasn't despair. It was something more ancient and destructive, belief. Thousands of terrified soldiers, millions of past victims, every person who had ever faced the warp and faltered, their collective fear created an echo. That echo shaped the breach, strengthened the demon, fed the entire devouring storm. The warp didn't create monsters out of nothing, it reflected them. And this thing reflected a fear so deeply rooted in humanity's history that the galaxy itself seemed to tremble from its presence. The Demon Prince sensed Neo's understanding and shrieked, charging with renewed fury. Its psychic voice tore at Neo's thoughts, demanding submission, promising annihilation. Neo opened his eyes, stepped sideways at the last moment, and the demon smashed through a pillar of corrupted stone, reducing it to dust. Neo moved behind it, placing his hand against the creature's back, not to strike, but to feel. The demon wasn't held together by muscle or bone. Its existence pulsed like a signal, a static-filled broadcast of fear. And for the first time, Neo felt something familiar, something like code. Not written code, not digital, but the architecture of meaning underneath reality. He pushed, not physically, but through intent, disrupting the pattern holding the demon together. The creature screamed, its wings glitching into jagged shapes before stabilizing again. It stumbled, then turned toward him with newfound fear of its own. Neo's breath came slower, deeper. He could feel the warp clinging to him, trying to unravel him, but he kept his mind sharp, anchored in clarity. This universe didn't follow the rules of his own, but the foundation was similar enough that he could read the distortions like an unstable program.
He moved again, each step synchronized with the rhythm of the breach. When the demon swung, Neo wasn't dodging instinctively. He was moving before the attack even took form, reading the pattern building inside the creature's core. He stepped under a massive claw, leaped onto the creature's arm, and drove his heel into the point where its form flickered the most. The demon convulsed, its body fracturing into lines of fractured light before knitting itself back together. Behind Neo, the Inquisitors and Stormtroopers were shouting to fall back, to let the Grey Knights handle the creature, but none of them approached. They didn't understand what Neo was doing. They couldn't. To them, he wasn't a warrior. He was an anomaly, behaving in ways that shouldn't exist outside the dreams of madmen and psychers. Inquisitor Thale watched from behind a fallen barricade, his bionic eye struggling to process Neo's movements. He muttered a prayer, mixed with a curse, unsure whether he was witnessing salvation or witnessing a new threat emerging in real time. The Demon Prince spread his wings wide, summoning a cyclone of warp energy that twisted the sky into spirals of screaming faces. He felt the pull trying to drag him upward, to tear apart his mind and scatter it through a dimension built on nightmares. His coat lifted in the rushing wind, but he forced his feet to remain grounded, pushing back against the psychic tide. The air cracked around him, reality bending like heated metal. He could sense the warp reacting to his resistance, as if he were an infection inside its system. Neo inhaled, steadied himself, and pushed forward through the cyclone. The warp winds tore at him, distorting his vision, filling his ears with echoes of lives that were never lived. For a moment, the ground vanished beneath him, and he stood in a kaleidoscope of fractured images, futures, memories, possibilities. He felt the warp trying to tempt him, offering illusions of Trinity, offering peace if he simply stopped resisting. But Neo had never been someone who surrendered to illusions. He had broken worlds built on lies. He let the images pass through him without attachment. The Demon Prince roared in frustration, slamming his claw toward him, but Neo met the strike with an open palm. The impact didn't rupture his arm, it sent a ripple through the demon's entire structure, as if Neo had hit the exact point where its existence was most fragile. The creature staggered, its torso flickering like a dying screen, and Neo realized he was finally reaching the heart of its pattern. He moved closer, each strike not meant to destroy, but to destabilize. Each movement synchronized with the pulses of the breach. Each touch dismantled a thread of fear woven into the demon's form. The battlefield trembled as the warp screamed louder, struggling to maintain its grip on reality. The breach pulsed violently, the edges glitching, folding, collapsing in and out of existence as Neo pressed deeper into the core of its structure. And with every step he took, the demon's towering form flickered more wildly, as if the very concept of it was beginning to unravel under Neo's relentless clarity.
The battlefield quieted for a moment, not because the fighting stopped, but because something deeper shifted, an almost imperceptible trembling in the fabric of the warp that even the Daemons seemed aware of. Neo stood at the center of the storm, his breath unsteady, his focus wavering as the world around him flickered between fractured realities. The warp breach pulsed like a wounded heart, shrinking in small convulsions only to swell again with renewed hunger. The Daemon Prince, weakened and flickering like a damaged projection, watched Neo with a mixture of fury and something that might have been fear. Neo sensed it, but didn't allow himself to be consumed by triumph. He knew better than to believe he understood everything happening around him. He had been mistaken before about the nature of reality. He had seen how certainty could blind a person. Yet here he was again, standing on the edge of understanding something impossible, something that wasn't quite code, but wasn't quite chaos either, something in between.
As he steadied himself, he felt the warp pressing into his consciousness with a weight unlike anything he had experienced in the Matrix. This place wasn't content to imprison minds, it wanted to consume, corrupt, reshape. It wasn't a prison, it was a hunger made dimensional. He could feel countless voices trying to seep into him, whispers promising him power, clarity, salvation, and in the same breath promising ruin, torment, extinction. They spoke with the voices of people he had known, Morpheus, Trinity, Smith, even though he understood they weren't real. The warp didn't need truth, it only needed emotion. And deep inside him, buried under layers of discipline and purpose, the warp found something to probe: doubt. Neo had always been guided by a sense of meaning. The Matrix had given him a purpose, a clear enemy, a clear path. He had been the one, the anomaly, designed to reset the system, the balance between control and chaos. But here, in the grimdark expanse of the 41st millennium, what did being the one even mean? The laws he once bent didn't exist the same way. The structures he overrode weren't here. There was no architect. There was no machine city. There was only war. Endless, exhausting war. And for the first time since arriving in this universe, Neo felt the weight of that realization pressing against his spirit. Was he still a savior? Or just another anomaly thrown into a place that didn't need him? The Daemon Prince sensed Neo's moment of doubt and lunged, its form splitting into a dozen overlapping shapes before merging into one monstrous charge. Neo reacted instinctively, his body moving before thought returned. He twisted aside, felt the shockwave of the creature's passing crack the ground beneath him, and countered with a strike that sent ripples through the daemon's flickering frame. But the creature didn't dissolve this time. Instead, it clung to its broken existence with stubborn, hateful strength. Neo realized the breach was feeding it, clinging to the prince's presence like an anchor. The breach didn't want to collapse. It wanted balance. It wanted belief. It wanted Neo as much as it wanted the daemon. He felt the attention of the battlefield on him. Hundreds of soldiers, half delirious from the terror of the warp, stared at him through smoke and fire, as if watching something they couldn't comprehend. They weren't seeing a psyker. They weren't seeing a mutant. They were seeing a man standing alone against something their universe had never been able to defeat without immense sacrifice. And in that moment, something shifted. Fear turned into hope, small, fragile, but unmistakable. He felt it rising from them like heat off scorched metal. They wanted to believe. They desperately needed to. And that belief flowed toward him, weaving into the shifting currents of the warp around him. He didn't want to be their symbol. He didn't want to replace their saints or their legends. That wasn't what he had come here for. He didn't even know why he had come here, but he couldn't stop the tide forming around him. In the Matrix, belief had shaped reality. Here, belief shaped the warp, and the warp shaped everything else. He felt it circling him, pulling at him, trying to weave him into the fabric of the breach. It would be so easy to lose himself in it, to become something more than human, something that existed not through code, but through the raw emotion of billions who had long forgotten peace. The Daemon Prince attacked again, and this time Neo didn't dodge. He stepped into the strike, letting the creature's claws pass harmlessly through a moment of altered perception as he reached into the rhythm of the warp. He didn't push with power. He pushed with intention. He didn't strike with force. He struck with clarity. His hand passed through the daemon's chest, not tearing it apart, but unraveling the emotional threads that held the creature together. The daemon's roar wavered, split into echoes, then dissolved into a cascade of fractured reality that scattered like ashes in the wind. The breach shuddered violently, contracting inward as if something essential had been torn away. Neo staggered back, breath ragged. He could feel the warp pulling at him, not with hostility, but with recognition. It wanted shape. It wanted definition. It wanted an anchor. He realized with a sinking feeling that the warp wasn't asking him a question. It was making an offer. It wanted him to choose what he would become in this universe where belief had power and despair had shape. Would he remain a man fighting against endless darkness, or would he become something more symbolic, something the warp itself would react to? He didn't know the answer. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. But he did know the eyes of the Imperium were on him. The warp was watching him. And somewhere beneath all the noise, buried deep within the collapsing breach, he sensed something observing him with a cold, calculating patience, as if waiting to see whether the one from another world would become another myth or another weapon.